My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. Most companies rely on contractors to get at least some of their work done. Often, there are layers of contractors, and that can lead to friction, miscommunication, or even disaster. Today's guest has thought about, written about, and researched some of the reasons for these problems and potential solutions as well. We'll talk about what you can do as a safety practitioner to make these relationships smoother and more efficient while taking safety into account. Ron Gantt is a certified safety professional with over 2 decades' experience in industries such as construction, utilities, and chemical manufacturing. He's currently Vice President of EHS for Beal Infrastructure, a data center developer. Ron has undergraduate degrees in occupational safety and health and psychology, as well as graduate degrees in safety engineering and resilience engineering. He's also a co-host of the Punk Rock Safety podcast. Ron joins us from California. Welcome.
Hi, how's it going, Mary? Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I think this will be a very practical, a very useful topic. So one of the reasons that to tackle this topic is something called the multi-party dilemma, which is a fancy word for. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yeah. So the multi-party dilemma, it's something that actually was sort of discovered in actually a non-safety world, in critical digital services, where they rely on a lot of contractors. They found that, in order to compete, you have to rely on these third parties, contractors, consultants, et cetera, to get work done. But in the process of doing that, kind of for the benefits you get for doing that, you created new opportunities for failures to happen. So, for example, they would find that, okay, the consultants, when you had let's say an outage in the software, for example, they would have to spend a lot of time getting them up to speed on their processes, which is not something you'd have to do for an internal person. So you get some of the expertise of the consultant and maybe some of the economic benefit, but you also have this downside of it. And so this sort of opportunity for failure that wasn't there before all of a sudden now becomes a problem because people have to spend time getting these people up to speed and figuring out how to coordinate with them. And so when I saw that in the kind of critical digital services space, I thought, oh my gosh, that sounds like a lot like what we deal with in construction and a lot of other safety, critical industries as well, where we rely on a lot of third parties and we have to, right? So, you sort of have to do that. But that also, so many safety people would relate to this where, relying on contractors creates new problems, new challenges, new risks. And so you have this dilemma where it's like, I either can't compete in this industry because I'm going to bring everything in house, or I have to introduce these new risks, these new challenges that I have to overcome.
I think our listeners are all going to just intuitively and through experience understand the issue. But I was curious, there are some famous, disasters or issues, but one that people don't talk about as much is the internet outage that involved Microsoft and CrowdStrike. And you mentioned that contractor relationships were a contributing factor to that. Do you want to just sort of touch on that?
Yeah. I'm certainly, again, no software expert, but I know a little bit about the incident, right? So one of the things that happens is you have, like Microsoft, for example, farms out parts of their services to other third parties like CrowdStrike in order to help their system work, right? The problem you have and the interesting sort of complexity in all this, and again, I think a lot of people in safety critical spaces will actually relate to this, is that CrowdStrike doesn't just work for Microsoft, right? When you work with third parties, they have other customers they're working with too, and you start to get these intertangling webs. And so CrowdStrike's working in other industries and other spaces, working with other platforms. And all of a sudden now, CrowdStrike can have an outage that ripples through systems that we didn't even think were connected. All of a sudden now these systems, are connected, and you have this massive outage, which that particular outage affected, I actually was flying home from London when that happened. That was a nightmare. Yeah. I was driving to the airport when I saw the first internet alert, and I was like, "Oh no, this is going to be a long day." You just walk through the airport and you see all these screens that just have that blue screen of death that we've all seen. When your computer kind of crashes. Who knew that the systems that were going to be managing the scheduling and even just the screens in airports were connected to the things that were in hospitals, which also had an outage. All right. And that had nothing to do with, just one company. That had everything to do with the connections between those organizations and how it just rippled out. You see a similar thing that happens for example, in the data center industry, where you have companies that, you can have two big data center construction jobs in the same kind of metro area. And, you're pulling in labor, you're pulling in contractors to help get the job done. Electrical contractor one, who's maybe the best in the area, you go to them and say, "Hey, can you work on this job?" And they say, "Yes, we absolutely can help you with that." And then the other job that's just down the road is also using that same electrical contractor. Well, all of a sudden now you're pulling from the same labor pool, and something that happens at that job, which has nothing to do with my job, now affects my job. You know what I mean? And so you see that same sort of interconnection just because one company's using the same processes as another company, which is, I think, happened in the CrowdStrike incident.
Yeah, it's kind of a perfect metaphor, really. I mean, it wasn't a metaphor for those who were grounded, but
No, I ended up getting stuck in Dulles Airport for like 8 hours, but at least I got to the United States before it really started to affect me. But yeah, it was messy. A lot of other people had it way worse than I did. I know that.
Okay, so in order to understand what specifically might go wrong, let's talk a little bit about what needs to go right. Can you explain or talk about the concept of common ground and how does it affect contracting relationships?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So common ground is something that, if we take it out of the contracting space in a minute and just think about interactions with other people in your day-to-day world, right? So you go to the coffee shop and you want to buy a cup of coffee. You walk up to the counter and you say to some other human being, "I would like a cup of coffee," and you hand them money. Well, that other human being has to understand what in the name of everything that is holy you are even talking about in that moment. Because think about how random that is. Like, that human being has to know that, okay, this person wants me to make coffee for them, and in exchange, they're going to give me money. And they need to know what the appropriate amount of money is. There's all this unspoken stuff that just happens without us even realizing it that makes it happen. And then, they take the money. We know that when they take the money, that means that at some point in the near future, they're also going to give me coffee for that money, not just they're just taking my money, right? So again, there's all these things that are just unspoken that just happen in order to help us be successful in that one little very basic transaction. And then you take that and expand it and think of the common ground that happens at a traffic intersection. You stop and you just assume that other people are going to stop when they're supposed to stop. And that happens most of the time, right? Like everybody stops at the red light. So when your light turns green, okay, I can probably go. Or, when it's your turn to go, that other people who could hit you probably are going to stop. And how do you know that? Because you have this sense of common ground that's facilitating your activity with those people. And the interesting thing is you are coordinating with them, even though you're not talking to them. You don't even know who they are. You don't know their names. And that's just because of the common ground that we've established as a society. Now put that into the contracting world, right? Contractor walks into your organization, you're hiring them to do a task, right? And so right off the bat, you have to believe that, like, okay, we both kind of know what the task is. Like when I say, "Hey, I need you to fix this pipe," or "I need you to build this building or install this electrical system," you kind of have to have an understanding and hope that they know what you mean. And yeah, we've tried to verify that through verification of trainings and stuff like that. But at some point, like, we have to trust them. And that trust is the common ground. Now, most of the time, like, small breaches of common ground don't matter, but sometimes it does. Sometimes when, think of, for example, we're having someone work on an electrical system and we need them to do it without, getting anybody hurt or killed. We assume that they know how that electrical system is going to work and how to isolate the energy source so that they can actually work on it successfully. But how do they know that? Like, how would they know that, right? Well, we assume that, okay, well, they're going to look at the appropriate, drawings and stuff like that. And conversely, they're going to assume that we have given them the appropriate drawings to do that successfully. But again, these are all assumptions that are being made. How did we establish that we can trust these people? Oftentimes we just do it. But I think what we're really doing is trying to build a sense of common ground so that I can, okay, I know this person. One of the ways you see this actually in a very practical way, and this isn't an intentional thing as an organizational, like something organizations do. This is something that people do naturally, just like a little shortcut anybody who's been in industry has done. We build relationships and we start to use people that we have relationships with. I call it the I got a guy syndrome, right? Like, you have something goes wrong. Oh, I got a guy who can handle that. And what is that? That's someone you have common ground with. Okay, how that person probably works most of the time. And okay, they're probably going to be able to handle that situation for you. That's someone you have pre-established common ground that you're going to draw on in order to facilitate you getting the job done. And people do that all the time. In my research, that's what I found, and it resonated with my own experience, that one of the first things a lot of people do in jobs is they try to build relationships with other people because it helps us know how, okay, how does that person operate? When they say this, that means, that they're really upset or that they're really, confident or that they don't know what's going on, right? So you think of all the little things, again, that help us coordinate with each other on a day-to-day basis. Well, that's something that we try to build in a job site, just again through those establishing of relationships, if that makes sense.
You talk about interpredictability, which is what you're talking about really here. Is that synonymous with trust? I mean, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it?
It kind of is, right? So it's probably easier just to call it trust at the end of the day, but it's also trusting. If something happens, you kind of have an idea of how someone's going to behave. Right. So, like, for example, right now, like in this conversation with you and I, if the technological systems, break down somehow, your internet dies, my internet dies, or, one of our computers dies, we probably have a vague idea of what the other person would do. But that's mostly based off of just, norms that we kind of all have in our head. You and I haven't really talked about it, though.
Right.
Like, hey, what would we do if that happened?
It would be super weird if we were just like, okay, bye.
Yeah.
And walked
exactly.
away.
Go back to our jobs. It's fine, right? We have a small amount of unpredictability that, okay, we probably won't walk away. We'll probably take some action to, reestablish a connection or something like that. But we haven't really established a strong amount of unpredictability. Now, imagine like the people you work with, your technological people who help you run this podcast. You probably have a much higher degree. Hey, if something happens, I kind of have an idea of what they're going to do if X, Y, or Z happens. Right. And so that to me is a sign that you have much stronger common ground with them, which if you think about that really creates a level of resilience in your team. Right. So I know if this unforeseen, or maybe it's a foreseen, but you just don't know when it's going to happen kind of event, like an internet outage, that's foreseen. We know what's going to happen. We just don't know when. When this happens, I know that this is how you're going to behave. And so that's going to make it much easier for me to act based on the assumption that, okay, if you're going to do this, then I can do that, knowing that you're going to be there. You can think of it like track runners doing the kind of the baton. I'm talking about the baton pass. Like, I know when I reach my hand back, I know you're going to put the baton in my hand. I don't have to look. We don't have to talk about it. I just know what's going to happen. Right. And that really facilitates really successful action efficiency, safety. I know, for example, going back to the lockout, if I hand you these drawings, I know that you know how to look at them and how to establish where the isolation points are, frees me up that I don't have to do as much. That interpredictability, it's trust, but it's not just like I trust you as an individual. I trust also your competency and your assessment of the situation, right? And that really helps people kind of establish what to do.
So I think people understand how common ground is helpful, but you talk about another factor in contractor relationships, and that's coordination costs. And this is something I think we all understand whether we have a label for it or not. So can you explain what you mean by that?
This is probably like the most important takeaway from our conversation is that this is something David Woods, one of the professors who was on my committee, has said a lot. Coordination costs continually. And his point is that like just working with other people is work, right? So it doesn't matter what you're doing in addition to that, the working with them is work because it creates a need for you to coordinate, right? There's actions that you have to do to make that coordination successful. Those are costs. So think right now, for example, you and I, we're working together to create this podcast, and we're kind of in the process of doing that. We're each doing our part, but we're also keeping an eye on the other person to see like, hey, are we doing this correctly? Does Mary want to say something now? Maybe I should shut up. Like, you know what I mean? Like we're trying to monitor the other person to see how the coordination is going and if we need to adjust. Because that's one of the things that humans do is once we've established common ground, it's not a check the box, we can move on with our lives. Common ground can be gained and lost over time. Right. So like, I could think that you and I have common ground, but then all of a sudden the situation changes. Maybe you in your mind, you're like, okay, here's how the podcast goes, and there's different phases where I'm thinking, no, it's just one phase. You move to a different phase, and all of a sudden where we had common ground, we no longer have it. Right. So you're keeping an eye on me, I'm keeping an eye on you, and I'm looking for cues that, okay, wait a minute, something's different. I need to adjust what I do in order to keep the coordination going well. Right. Again, that's a cost. And at a very simple level, anybody who's worked on a team where you have a team member who's new and maybe doesn't fully understand the project kind of gets this. Or imagine you're trying to cook. And I think this is an example Dave Woods used. You're trying to cook and you bring a 5-year-old into the kitchen to help you cook. I mean, all of a sudden now there's additional effort you have to give to that person, right? That's an extreme case, but at a very basic level, we are all trying to make sure that our work goes well together. So at a contractor, think of like construction or any sort of contracting relationship, we're always working together, but we're also monitoring the other side to see if the relationship's going well. Now, this is where it gets really interesting too, because the costs are not equal on either side of the boundary. So like the amount of effort it takes for a customer to, quote unquote, reach across the boundary and, see what's going on the other side is far less than the cost the other side. So like our customers, for example, it's really difficult for me to go along and them and say, go to them and say, hey, could you walk me through your processes so I can make sure that they're aligned with ours? Our customer can easily just look at me funny and be like, no, I don't want to do that.
So that sort of speaks to, I was going to ask, what happens when the coordination costs get too high? That's what it sounds like you're describing here.
What typically happens, there's a number of things people can do, but like an easy thing that people do all the time is they just shed load. And so what that means, think of all the times where you've been working with people, but then all of a sudden it's a high pressure situation. The tempo picks up, running out of time, or the workload increases. And now all of a sudden you're like, okay, I don't have time to work with you. I'm just going to do it myself. Or I don't have time to explain to you how to do it or where I'm at in the process so you can get up to speed. So I'm just going to do it myself. That's one of the things that happens. Now in a kind of a customer contractor relationship, what that ends up happening is that, and this is something I found in my research, and again, it coincides with my experiences, a lot of contractors in that situation will still exert effort, but they're exerting effort to actually keep the customer away. right? Like it's sort of like we're putting up a smoke screen so that they think everything's fine and they just leave us alone so we can go and do the real work. As a result, what ends up happening is it's no longer a coordination. It's just you pay me and I move on with my life, right? We're not really doing it's not that different than the coffee shop example in that situation, right? Whereas, in an ideal world, the way it's supposed to work is it's much more of a partnership. Everybody kind of talks about that. We want a partnership. We want to work well together and use our relative expertise in order to deal with this project that we're working on. Well, when the coordination costs get high, and one of those costs can be the risks of coordination, right? So like if for example, a contractor is too open, that creates the risk of looking like they're incompetent. And now all of a sudden the customer doesn't want to work with them anymore. And that it has a much higher effect on the contractor. And so they're going to tend to hide stuff more often, if that makes sense. So basically when the costs get high, the coordination is going to start to break down depending on where the costs are coming from.
You're talking about one of the costs being how you control information. And that's anyone who's had to rewrite an email 3 times to get just the right words so that they can get their message across without hurting feelings.
And you think about that, like that effort to get the message across without hurting feelings is a coordination cost because you're trying to manage multiple things. I'm trying to get the message across, but I'm also trying to manage the long-term relationship because you can get the message across and say, hey, stupid, this is what I mean. Don't be so dumb next time, right? You would get the message across, but you would sacrifice that long-term goal. And I think this is, so the number one kind of thing I would like people to take away from contracting is that coordination costs. There's always costs associated with it. It's work. But the second thing is that it's difficult work. It takes effort and it often is complex and has trade-offs that people have to make, like you just described, right? So like a contractor, for example, is in a situation where they not only need to coordinate well with their customer, but they also have to make it look like they're doing a good job no matter what, even if things are starting to fall apart. Because, there's a sacrifice, sort of if they, just open the door and show it what's going on, all of a sudden now there's a risk that they're going to take that customer's not going to understand what's going on. And so that creates this sort of cat and mouse game where these two sides are trying to deal with the present situation, but also manage a long-term relationship, over time. Which back to the point I made earlier about how people manage kind of common ground through building relationships. If you think about it, that's a good thing, but it also creates and sometimes makes this trade-off hard.
Yeah, and you've pointed out that that's actually in some ways inherent in the structure of the relationship itself. Like this isn't necessarily avoidable. I mean, some of the challenges are perhaps avoidable, but it's not like there's a magic formula to prevent having costs of coordination or to prevent having to build common ground.
No, 100%. Actually, this is just the nature of coordination. Like human social systems require us to be able to build a sort of set of norms and beliefs about how we're going to work well together and how the world works and what you're going to do when X happens so that I can do Y. That's just how work happens. That's not a feature of incompetent contractors or people not doing enough communication or something like that. We don't really pay attention to it because A, we're really good at it. We're so good at it that it just happens. But B, it's not that every time we have a breakdown that it's catastrophic, right? Like if, for example, you and I, like, hey, you were thinking that the conversation was going to go one way and I go a different way. It's not like, oh, the podcast just broke. We're done.
That's it. We're done.
Yeah, it's over. Cancel everything. It's, we often will just repair the coordination through some other mechanism or just leave it alone. It's not even worth repairing. And so we don't even pay attention to these little breakdowns, but they're happening all the time. Right. And so it's often really easy to just downplay it. Right. But as a result, I think what happens is we don't take it seriously. And so we don't organize in a way that allows us to coordinate better with people. Right. We just let it happen naturally, which again, most of the time it's going to work. But sometimes, like in the CrowdStrike incident or in Deepwater Horizon or in numerous other instances where we can point to, interrelations between contractors, NASA Challenger, interrelations between the contracting agency and the organization itself, and breakdowns on common ground. It can be catastrophic and it could kill people. Unfortunately.
Yeah, and you also mentioned sometimes there's, or not even sometimes, often there are authority differentials. And when you said NASA, that made me think of that, right? Like there's a command structure and that has effects on building common ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that authority differential that you're going to have in most contracting relationships comes from the idea that if you think about it, a perfectly symmetrical relationship would be like if either party breaks off the relationship, it will have this similar negative effect to both sides, right? But most of the time that's not the case, right? Most of the time, if one side breaks off the relationship, hey, if the customer breaks off a relationship, there's probably 5 other contractors that are out there they can go pull from. That's not always the case, but that's often the case. And in my industry, for example, where we have a very small customer base in the data center, hyperscale data center industry, the hyperscalers, there's depending on how you count them, 5 or 6 in the entire world. If we lose the ability to work with those, lose the ability to work with 2 of them, that could be the end of our business, right? So, but if they lose the ability to work with us, there's 40 other lease providers that could probably find, who would do the work and happily do it for them. And so as a result, that creates this sort of dynamic where the consequences for coordinating poorly are not the same across the board. And again, you get this situation where information flow from one side to the other is not the same as a result of that. Because if we send the wrong information across the board, that's going to be much more consequential for our side than it is for our customer side. And then as a result, you can, again, kind of going back to what we've been talking about, as a result, that means the coordination costs are unequal because it's going to take much more effort on our side. I mean, when we get a message that goes across to a customer, we often look at it closely. Okay, is this right? Let's review it internally before we send it, kind of thing. You can't just send an off the cuff email, you know what I mean? Because that's really problematic if we say the wrong thing. Whereas they could probably just send an off the cuff email and we'll be like, oh, that's fine. They just were cranky that day. It's not a big deal. Whereas it could be we lose the contract on our side of it, and then as a result, that means common ground is harder to create and maintain because they have no idea for sure what's really going on our side, right? And so you have this weird dynamic because of that authority differential.
Okay, so we've established that there are coordination costs, that common ground is incredibly important. So now we get to, what do you suggest to help mitigate this since it's baked into the structure? Yeah, what do we do?
So again, I think number one is we need to take this part of the work seriously, right? So when you are doing a contracting relationship, don't make the mistake of saying, okay, we can either do it in-house or we can do a contractor. And if we do a contractor, we just hire them and tell them what to do, and then they just do it. It's not that simple. It's never that simple. When you hire a contractor, you're creating a new form of work. How are the people who have to do that work set up to do it? So on our side of the house, if we're hiring contractor, we have to think, okay, who's going to manage it? How are they, how are we going to give them time and space in order to do it effectively? Think about writing the email 3 times, like you just said, right? That's something that, hey, are we actually giving these people the time to really think about how to build that common ground with those people? One of the things we're doing, for example, in my organization to build more common ground with our contractors is we're spending a lot more time on the front end just talking about not just what the project is, but how we see the project. How do you think about these sorts of things? When it comes to safety, for example, hey, let's say an incident happened. How do we want to think about that? What do you guys do? What do we do? What are the concerns you have in that situation? And it sounds really esoteric, but when we've had those conversations, it's actually led to some interesting things. We're like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know you thought about it like that. Here's how we think about it. And then we can kind of come to an agreement. Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's move forward based on that understanding. One of the people in those meetings that we had recently with one of our general contractors had a really great question that I think exemplifies what we're talking about. He asked the question, how do we want to argue together?
That's
Because
a
eventually,
great question.
right?
Really. It is. It is.
It's so powerful, right? Because we know through the life of the project, like we're gonna have an argument at some point. We're gonna disagree. So, what are the expectations when we argue? Like, some of the things you find when you have those discussions is like stuff that maybe we didn't think were a big deal, all of a sudden are a much bigger deal for them. Hey, if you use this terminology and our leadership hears about it, they're going to escalate it. And all of a sudden it's a formal issue. Whereas, on our side, it was just an off the cuff statement. We know now, thinking back to writing your email, we actually are now a little bit smarter about how to craft those kinds of emails if we need to craft those kinds of emails, right? So we're building that common ground so that we know how we're going to coordinate, especially we know how to coordinate in those high pressure situations. And if you think about it, that builds that kind of interdependency, right? So I kind of know or interpredictability rather, that's the word I was looking for. I kind of know how they're going to respond if I say X, Y, or Z, which makes things a little bit easier for us. So I think number one is taking it seriously and spending more time on the front end, building that common ground. That's the first piece of it. The second piece of it that I would do is, as the project continues, don't take it for granted that everybody's always on the same page. Build in, opportunities for us to connect with one another whenever possible. I'm actually a big proponent of and this is not always possible and maybe not always appropriate, but whenever possible, like commingle. Like, so oftentimes you have people be in different trailers in construction, right? So there's the customer trailer, there's the other trailer. Sometimes that's necessary, but as much as possible, like, hey, let's go and work next to each other. There was a head of safety, and this is not in a contractor situation, but I think it applies to what we're talking about. There's a head of safety for a public works for a city that I was talking to a number of years ago, and we were just talking about what she's done really, and she's proud of in her work and safety. And one of the things she said is like the best thing that she did to improve the safety culture in her organization was she moved her office and her team's office from City Hall to the yard where the workers were. And she changed their work hours so that they started at the same time as the workers did. And the things said that was so powerful, I just thought was like, that's it. And I think it applies very much in the contracting situation. Is she said, well, when you arrive at the parking lot at the same time and you're walking through the parking lot together, you get that opportunity to say, hey, how are you doing? How was your weekend? How are your kids? Right. And so you're building that kind of understanding, that common ground, even at a relational level, which makes it easier back to the conversation about arguments, right? So if I have just a random person who makes an off the cuff statement to me, I have no idea what that person's intentions are. I'm just totally relying on my assessment of the situation, my own temperament, kinds of things. Whereas like if someone I know, someone I've, maybe had lunch with and we've talked and I kind of, heard about their family and, we've had some good interactions together, makes an off the cuff statement, I'm much more likely to, oh, okay, that's just John. He's having a bad day. Give him the benefit of the doubt. And so the costs of maintaining common ground go down significantly just from that intentionally creating opportunities for people to build and maintain relationships throughout the project. So I think those are two big things that we can do. I'll pause there. There's like a third one that I think might be good, but I don't have as much experience with it, but there is some evidence to support it. But let me pause there. Like, does that make sense so far?
It does. It does. I find it interesting that people do this organically anyway. And I mean, we all see this. We're social animals in groups. Some people are great at it and some people are really not. So, but what I wanted to ask actually was, you're talking about having a person, or maybe it's not like a full-time person, but someone whose role it is to manage these coordination costs and to keep an eye on common ground. Do you think, and it might depend on the context, but do you think the onus is on the customer or the contractor, or does it really just kind of depend on the situation? To bring that person in, rather. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this actually came out of my research. In my dissertation, I called it like a coordinator. or a choreographer, if you will, to coordinate the dance between the different parties. But since then, I think, from talking to another friend of mine named Daniel Hummerdahl, he said, hey, maybe a better analogy is a host, like host for like a party or something like that, because it's this sort of role would be for someone who's just going to keep an eye on the situation, make sure everybody's getting what they need. You set appropriate boundaries. Yeah, don't go into that room, that's where, I don't know, the dog is or whatever. But, in general, making sure that things are going well, keeping an eye on how people are interacting, stuff like that. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. And so this could be a project manager role. It could be other functions. It doesn't have to be a full-time person, but someone needs to be keeping an eye on, hey, are we coordinating well together? Not just is the project going well, but are we coordinating well? Because that's going to be a key differentiator. Now, to your question about like, where does this come from? My personal sense is in an ideal world. And this is also based on my experience. It helps if the party that has the most authority, like that in that authority differential kind of relationship, it helps if they are the ones who start it. And so it maybe comes from them. And then, then you build I think from there, a joint sort of hosting of the situation. But it's often much more risky for the contractor to start that kind of process. So I think it helps often if, like in our case, for example, we are trying to take the initiative to be that kind of host with our general contractors. Actually, that's explicitly one of our core safety principles, is actually be a good host, because we know that, okay, yes, everybody says we need to build a partnership. Everybody pays lip service to that. And to your point, sometimes it happens organically, but we want to do it intentionally. And it needs to start with us. We need to like in the EHS world, I'm basically adopting that role. Now, the problem, of course, is that not everybody who's listening to this, and not even our organization, is always on that side of the fence, right? Sometimes you're on the other side where you have the lower authority, and the other side, I don't know, for one reason or another, they're just not doing it. So who's going to start the process? In that situation, I think there's still opportunities to do it. You can start the process just by understanding that, okay, we need to create space for ourselves and for our partners on the other side of the fence to coordinate well. It's a little bit more risky, so you might take some baby steps. You might just like say, hey, even start asking questions like, hey, how do you want us to disagree with each other when the time comes and we need to disagree? Kind of informal way, starting those conversations of how you're going to really work well together, and just see how they respond. And if they respond well, keep pushing, and maybe even kind of introduce the idea of like, hey, maybe we need to take some time and actually build some common ground with each other, or, commingle during the project and things like that. If they're not responsive, then okay, well, you kind of know what's going to happen. And back to something we said earlier about in those situations where you maybe don't have good common ground, the coordination costs are higher. So now you know that on your side of the house, there's going to be additional costs. How are you going to manage that? And so the host, for example, can, okay, well, this is not going to be a fun party. How are we going to manage it so it doesn't mess up the house, so to speak, right? So you're still managing the coordination, even if you're not doing it as cooperatively as you would like it to be. So the short answer to your question is it can come from either side. I would advocate the first step is often best taken from the side with the most authority.
You also talk about like even just framing the idea of the coordination. And you gave the example that people tend to frame it as how do we get people to do what we need them to do? But that's the wrong question to be asking. So what should people... How should we shift mindset about that?
A better question, maybe not the better question. I'm sure there's all kinds of better questions than that. But like, you're right that a lot of times we ask, hey, how do I get these contractors to just do what I need them to do and shut up? Maybe they don't say shut up, but you know what I mean? I think a better question is, how are we going to work well together in order to achieve success together, right? Like, that's what we're all trying to do at the end of the day, is a much better definition of success. And this gets actually to that, one other kind of point that I don't have personal experience with, but I think is worth exploring heavily, is inherent in the nature of this relationship just by, you can even, it's in the name, contractor, is contracts. These contracts often create legal constraints, and a lot of times it's interesting, and I found this in my research, and again, I think it coincides with a lot of people's experience, how we interact with these contracts. Like, we often use them pejoratively. We talk about, hey, we need good contracts, but you don't want to ever be contractual, right? Because if you're always going back to the contract, that, kind of means you don't have a good relationship. So we want to, you often hear people talk about using the contract and like threatening to use the contract as a almost like a punishment for not coordinating well. Well, to me, and I think that speaks to the inherent nature of a lot of these contracts are very much like a shut up and do it, kind of mentality. It's just defining, okay, here's what I need you to do, just go do it. There's other types of contracting relationships that are out there, though, and I know some people probably listening to this are familiar with them, but there are relationships out there that are much more contractually designed to work together, not you do this and we do that, but no, we are going to do this together, and this is how we're going to define how we relate. Even in some parts of the world, and like I know this is the case in the UK, there's even some standards that are in place on how you can build in, they call it relational contracting, how you can build in coordination into the contract. Like, not to, I wouldn't recommend it get to this level, but it's effectively kind of like answering the question, how are we going to argue, but in the contract, right? And in a positive way, not in a, we're going to go to arbitration kind of way, kind of
Well,
thing.
it's kind of the opposite of who are we going to blame if something goes wrong,
Exactly.
right? Because I think
Yeah.
that's a traditional contract. Who are we going to blame?
Exactly, right? That's a really good way of framing it. And so I think, whether you do it through the contract or not, I think, exploring the contractual relationship is an important part of this conversation as well. But I think in general, reframing this conversation to, hey, I just need to hire these people to do this job, to, hey, this is complex work. And yes, these are experts, but they're experts in a technical understanding of the work. They're not experts in our specific job site. They're not experts in our specific processes, and they're not experts in our specific people. Those three things are going to have to come from us and given to them. So we have to coordinate well with them. There has to be a partnership. And so back to your point about the question, I think, how are we going to work well together? How are we going to deal with the complexity of this work in a way that helps us all be successful? I think that's a better way to frame this challenge of coordination, if that makes sense.
Sounds to me like, not to upset any lawyers, but it's a bit of a call to action too. Like, I'm sure that there's ways that we can write more cooperative or more coordinated relational contracts without without sacrificing the legal stuff that has to be in there.
Absolutely. Well, and I think the challenge I would give to the legal profession specifically, and people who are dealing specifically with these contractors, or these contracts rather, is in my own research. And again, I think anybody who's worked in industry that will know that this is happening. People are already violating contracts. So the stuff that contracts are designed to help mitigate the risk of, people are routinely going around that. Like, some of the relationship building that we described earlier is specifically to allow people to violate contractual standards without risk to them individually. Because it's like, okay, we can both, Mary, yeah, we got to do it this way, but this way's a better way. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And you're not going to get me in trouble. I'm not going to get you in trouble, because I know that, hey, we have a pre-established relationship. So that's happening right now. And it's happening not because these people are evil or dumb or really love breaking contracts. They're doing it because they think that's the best way to get the work done and coordinate well with the other side. So to me, like, the risk is already, like, the risk that we're trying to mitigate is already, like, we're exposed to it. It's happening. I think we need to admit that and find better ways, because the best way to mitigate the risk is actually to help the coordination go successfully. If the coordination goes successfully, the risk is negligible.
And I wanted to ask you, I always end on a few questions that I ask people. So the first one is, if it were up to you, where would you focus training for the next generation of safety professionals? Not necessarily in terms of contracting, just in general. Is there an area that you think is kind of underserved?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would have safety professionals be good consumers of evidence and generators as a byproduct of it. This is probably going to be a bit sound weird and a bit surprising, but I actually don't believe that, and I wasn't trained this way when I first became a safety professional, and I have no reason to believe that it's changed since then. I believe safety professionals are trained to be good consumers of regulations and quote unquote best practices, but not of being able to look at, okay, what does the evidence actually say about these things? How can I evaluate that to know whether that is an appropriate intervention for my situation or not? And then ultimately, the hope is then they can then start to actually generate their own evidence. Because one of the things they would find very quickly is that there's actually not a lot of evidence to support a lot of what the safety profession does from a research perspective. And so hopefully then they would start to generate evidence which would benefit the entire profession.
And probably be a little bit less frustrating too, right? If you're
100%.
working with what's happening rather than what you think should be happening.
Absolutely. I think one of the challenges a lot of safety professionals face is that we come to organizations and we say, here's what we have to do. And if we're challenged in that, which we are sometimes and reasonably so in some situations, I'm like, hey, why are we doing it this way? How does this benefit us? We often don't have actually a really good answer to that. So we end up pointing back to, oh, well, OSHA says we have to do it, or the regulator says we have to do it, or, oh, this is what other great Alcoa or this other great organization did, that's supposedly really good at safety. And so if we want to be good at safety, we should do it too. But that's really weak evidence. Like, that's easy to poke holes in, and anybody like who's really skeptical, and again, maybe reasonably so, will poke holes in it and will lose credibility really quickly.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of yelling best practices and then
Yeah,
running
exactly.
away.
Because I like it and it's shiny.
Exactly. If you could go back in time to the beginning of your safety career, is there a piece of advice that you might give yourself?
I would spend a lot, outside of the whole evidence thing, I would spend a lot more time early on in my career learning about people, not in the safety profession, like about, whether it's psychology, sociology. And if it is psychology, it would not just be behavioral psychology, because it seems like safety is really stuck on behavioral psychology. But the other types of psychology, social psychology, ecological psychology, environmental psychology, sociology, like I said, those kinds of things. Spend time learning about that, because I've found once I finally realized, oh, that stuff's really important, a lot of light bulbs went off. Like, oh, well, this is why we're doing it this way. Or, oh, that way we're doing it actually doesn't make sense. Let's go this direction. Things started to click a lot more. So I would say, okay, get into those books earlier, rather than spending, time becoming the expert in regulation X. Or
How can our listeners learn more about the topics either in our discussion today or, things that would be useful, books, websites?
That's a good question. When it comes to coordination, there's a lot of really good, interesting research that's out there. Like I said, in the critical digital services space, I would highly recommend look up anything from Laura McGuire, Dr. Laura McGuire. She's a colleague. She works at Ohio State, but she's done a lot of research in this area. Others such as Sarah Butt, and then Alex, and his last name is escaping me, but Sarah and him co-wrote a paper on the multi-party dilemma. I think looking and seeing what they're doing and what they're seeing, you'll start to see, oh, that actually sounds a lot like what we're doing over here. I think that's one area that people need to pay attention to. And then, eventually I'll have a book chapter published that will go over, I've already written it. I think I shared it with you, and that goes over a little bit more of my research in this area. I think that'll be helpful for people. Yeah, I think those are the two big things I recommend to people to look at when it comes to contracting stuff, if that makes sense.
And if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to find you on the web?
Probably LinkedIn is the easiest. I'm always gettable on there. And then, I'm happy to, if anybody wants to set up a time to talk more in depth on it, I'm always happy to have a conversation with people.
Folks, that is about it for today. So thank you, Ron, for chatting.
Thank you, Mary. It was a lovely chat.
And my thanks also to the Safety Labs team who make sure we have high quality sound and video to share with all of you.
Thanks, Safety Lab team. Safety Lab wizards. Sorry.
No. They appreciate it. I'd like to thank our listeners and ask you a wee favor. If you've learned anything helpful from our podcast, please leave a rating and review to help other people find us. Bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.